Indiana Disability History Project, Indiana Institute on Disability and Community, Indiana University.
It's the first Center for Independent Living in Indiana.
Okay, well, wait a minute, we haven't started yet, sorry.
But just so you know,
Okay, yes.
and I've been there for 23 years. Before that, I was with vocational rehabilitation going back to --
Okay,
and was a supervisor, and today I'm still a certified rehab counselor.
so maybe you'd like to also talk about what things were like with voc rehab in that era?
Yeah, and that would be pretty positive discussion, especially compared to now, and I'm not sure. I mean, it's
Okay.
changed probably
Well,
for the
that's-
worst.
That's kind of what we're looking for, is that sweep of,
Yeah.
how things have progressed, or in some cases not progressed over
Yeah.
the years, as it relates to the state of Indiana, so.
Well, that would be, I do have that background working with rehab facilities
Okay.
and the employment part of it, and worked also for the passage of the ADA in the late 80s. Was part
all
of.
right. Well, you're obviously somebody who
Yeah.
has a lot to tell us, so what we do is when Peg edits the video, the questions, my voice will not be heard. So if you can put in your answer, basically put my question as a statement, that would
Okay.
really help.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yep, sure does.
Great. And then you can look at me rather than the camera.
Okay.
And it's very informal, so if there's something that we don't ask you that you want to say, just go right ahead.
Okay. That sounds like a winner. All right.
So we'll start by asking, can you tell us your name, where you live, and where you were employed?
David Nelson, live in Fort Wayne, Indiana now, and employed by the League for the Blind and Disabled in Fort Wayne. It's a Center for Independent Living that's serving 11 northeast counties of the state.
Excellent. And tell us about how you got involved with the League for the Blind and Disabled.
I got involved with the League back in 1990. I was working for the state of Indiana for vocational rehabilitation. I was supervising vocational rehabilitation counselors in 4 counties. And I had a staff member, a counselor, tell me that I didn't belong there anymore and that I should be looking for something else. She, I think, was concerned about some of the limits that you have when you work for state government. But the League was a Center for Independent Living. It was in trouble at the time. It served only people who were blind. It was then called the Allen County League for the Blind, and it had become a country club board and kind of an organization that lost touch with the people it served. It was a Center for Independent Living, but back then the regulations were such that you could technically serve one population. The law back at that time said that you had to serve people with a variety of disabilities, and the argument was, well, 75% of people who are blind have other disabilities, therefore we serve people with a variety of disabilities. It was a loophole that a lot of centers, single disability centers, used back in the 80s.
What was that law that you're referring to?
I'm referring to Title VII of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 as amended throughout the years. Title VII established centers for independent living, piloted 5 centers to help develop the model that the feds wanted to go with initially in the 70s. They piloted 5 centers, groups like Paraquad in St. Louis, the Center for Independent Living in Berkeley, California, and 3 others that I forget. But in the late 70s and early 80s, they started rolling out the funding for centers for independent living. And our executive director at the time, Francis Shine, went after the funds. The law at the time said that you had to serve people with a variety of conditions. That meant a single disability group could go after it. And the law also gave the first right of refusal to state government. So if the state government said, we want that money from the feds and we will administer it, the states got it. Indiana opted not to take that money. And the law was written, the regulations were written to say if the state opts out, then the feds will contract directly with nonprofit organizations. So that's the way the law was back then. The League, after the state opted out, the League went after that money and got it. Now, it was a single disability organization, not what we consider centers today. And the League was one of many organizations in the country that did that. Today, they could not do that. The law and the regulations are tight enough that you can't exclude people from your services based on the presence or the absence of a disability. So it's much cleaner today.
Were there other states then that opted out, like Indiana did?
Yes, the majority of states in the country opted out. The law also said that if the state government put in more Centers for Independent Living money than the feds did, that they could administer the federal money if they chose to. So there were some states that did put in more money, but they still chose not to, over time, administer the federal money. So I believe at this point there are only 2 states in the country, last I knew, that managed that Centers for Independent Living money, that money came through state government to go out to centers. I think only 2 states in the country now are set up that way. So Indiana wasn't unusual in opting out, but it created an environment that a nonprofit could go directly to the federal government and go after those funds. A lot of times that money comes through states or counties or other sources. Most Center for Independent Living money from the feds, Title VII money, Part C, that amount set for centers, goes directly to Centers for Independent Living from the Department of Education.
And is that the same today as it was back then? Has that remained the same?
Yes, there's a couple of pots of money that states use, several pots of money that states use. Title VII has a section of the Rehab Act, has a Part C section that is the enabling legislation for Centers for Independent Living dollars, federal dollars. Most of that goes directly to centers. Title VII also has another Part B dollars, that can be used for a variety of sources, including the support of Centers for Independent Living. Now, those Part B dollars do go to the state, but then the state can put them out for a number of things, surveying, needs stuff, just a variety of things that they can do. They can support state councils for independent living with it, and they can fund Centers for Independent Living. So those Part B dollars continue to go through the state, as they always have, under a different title at the time. You know, those title headings have changed with reauthorizations. But those now Part B dollars have always gone through the state, and they continue to. And a chunk of those dollars today in Indiana do come from the state to centers. But the Part C, that federal enabling stuff for centers, funding for Centers for Independent Living, that goes directly to centers in most states without going through the state.
So it sounds like the funding hasn't changed too much. Are there things that have changed in independent living centers?
Well, the feds eventually tightened up the requirement on cross-disability, in other words, serving people from all groups of people with severe disabilities. They have tightened up that language. We knew that was coming. The feds over the time from the late 70s to today set up, they always had a set of standards and assurances in the regulations, but they set up a set of, they defined what those standards were. They over time, the regulations have grown to be very specific on when it says the standard is cross-disability, what does that mean? What do centers have to comply with? So that's evolved. So the standards, we now have what they call indicators for those standards, so that we know if you meet these indicators, you're in line with this particular standard. So that's grown over time. There has been a growth in federal Part C dollars over time. Now, it's been stagnant for many years now. But there was a time when we had an influx of Part C money, federal Part C money coming into Indiana, that we used to start a number of centers at that time. So there have been some pretty significant changes. And now, we're looking at another potentially significant change in the Rehabilitation Act and in Title VII, Independent Living title, with the new reauthorization that we're trying to get through. Independent living at the federal level is under Rehabilitation Services Administration in the Federal Department of Education. And we're trying to get it out of the Department of Education. We are not that. We are human service, and that's where we belong. And we're also trying to get independent living set up as its own federal administration. Because right now, independent living is buried so deep in the federal bureaucracy that it's hard to have a voice at high levels of federal government because we're buried so deep. That needs to change. People with disabilities' voice should not be muffled under 3 or 4 layers of other interest groups. So that has changed, and we're hoping to see another major change with the reauthorization if we can ever get that through Congress. I mean, we have a bipartisan bill in the Senate right now that was crafted by both Republicans and Democratic leaders. It's there right now. Whether the Senate, whether the House will let it get through, we have no idea. So.
What about changes at the state level? Is there any legislation pending or anything that's been proposed that relates to independent living centers?
Well, that's a great question. Years ago, we'll go back to the federal law. The federal law gives us what the definition of centers is. And if you are a residential service provider, you're not in line with the definition. So the definition is the basics. Then it gives us standards and assurances and the indicators for the standards. So back in the 90s, we worked with, in the General Assembly, we worked with Senator John Sinks, I think it was, and a House member too, and I can't remember his name. We wanted to include the federal requirements in state statute. The idea was that if state money becomes available for Centers for Independent Living, we want to be sure that that state money goes to organizations that meet the criteria for centers. We didn't want a nursing home saying, we're a center for independent living, we're eligible for that money, that state money, because it's not federal now that we're talking about. So there was a definitions bill, I believe, for autism on the table that John Sinks and a House member, both General Assembly, Republicans in the General Assembly, but they allowed us to tack on an amendment to that definitions bill. And in that amendment, in state statute, we defined what centers were, and we mirrored the federal regulation in state statute with the idea that we want to protect those state dollars to make sure they're going to what they were intended to do. We didn't want the politics of special interest groups to divert those dollars. So in Indiana, I'm guessing that was maybe mid-90s, maybe a little earlier than that, we got a state statute that took care of that problem. That was a big deal. There are states that I know of that have had their money go to places that it should not, that Centers for Independent Living should not have gone. We in Indiana basically preempted that before it even happened here. So that was a good move in this state. Another thing that happened, probably 5 or 6 years ago, Centers for Independent Living were never included in the General Assembly budget, in the state budget, as a line item. We were always, if we got state money for Centers for Independent Living, the money was discretionary, and then maybe they would pull some funds that they had left over from Social Security reimbursement, from vocational rehabilitation. But those dollars could be just as discretionarily offered as they were taken away. So we got, probably 5 or 6 years ago, the first time funding in the state budget for Centers for Independent Living. Now, it's not the complete amount that we get, but it is at least a toehold, it's a hold in that state budget. Another change, and I'm kind of talking about money now because a lot of times you have to follow the money first to understand how you got where you're going. The relationship with what the feds call the designated state unit, that unit that's responsible for Centers for Independent Living, the DSU. Those relationships in Indiana had not always been very good. Every state that gets federal money, whether it's directly to centers or that money that goes to states that can be used for other stuff, independent living stuff, every state, to get that money, has to have a federally approved plan, a state plan for independent living, SPIL, SPIL, State Plan for Independent Living. That plan is unique. It's federally mandated. That plan is unique because it's the State Council for Independent Living. In Indiana, it's the it's ICOIL. That council has signature. The state DSU and the council both have signature authority over that plan. So if the state comes up with a plan and they want to run it through the feds, if it's not signed by the State Council for Independent Living, the feds reject it. Indiana tried that once. It is not a valid plan unless this citizen body signs off on it. How cool is that? How democratic is that? The council is a majority of people with disabilities. It's perfect for us. And those plans were often in the past battle zones. Centers wanting to grow its network, our network. It's federally mandated that states do that. States not really recognizing centers as a priority. This whole movement, this disability rights movement of people saying, this medical model where we're broken and the professionals are the experts here to fix us, we shut up, we do what they say. That whole model was replaced with this model of consumer control. The experts are the people who have severe disabilities. I'm not sure we were ready to buy that in this state. Probably not in a lot of states. So the state plan would become a battleground where leaders of the state council, a council that I served on a number of years and chaired for 3 years, where it would come right down to the wire where we were negotiating what had to be in that plan and funding for centers and withholding our approval and our signature because the state did not have a plan unless we signed off on it. Some of those negotiations, I remember one in particular, Nancy Griffin was in there as a leader of ICOIL, Carrie Kelsey was a part of the executive committee of ICOIL at that time, myself. It literally came down to the last 30 seconds before that meeting was about to be over when we finally got the things that we needed. So in Indiana, in the past, in the 90s, and probably in the early 2000s, we had a difficult relationship with the state of Indiana. That's not the case now. And we should be proud of that in this state. That relationship at this point in time is good. We've got some great people in the DSU in vocational rehabilitation that we work with. Christy Russell and a number of the folks in state government have been strong supporters. I mean, they've drank the Kool-Aid. They understand what this is about. And they know that this is the right way to go. So we've had, for the last number of years, a pretty positive relationship with the state, and that's a huge difference. Before that, not only the state plan under Mitch Robe, FSSA, there were some terrible battles that went on. Battles that we literally were producing 150-page documents of documentation of what we were being told and what they were actually doing, and the discrepancies that we were getting out of FSSA, published them and distributed them to every member of the General Assembly, pulled in the media from all over the state. I mean, those were some pretty hard-fought battles. We're not going through that now. My hope is that in Indiana, we've learned at the political level the value of this model that says the people you serve are the experts in service. My hope is that we've learned that. We'll see. Politics come and go.
I may have missed it, but if you could spell out what iCoil is and when that started?
Yeah.
If we just-
iCoil stands for the Indiana Council on Independent Living, and iCoil is the acronym. That was originally, a state council was originally required in the enabling legislation in the Rehab Act, but it didn't have a lot of authority. It was an advisory council. And then as time went on and reauthorizations of the Rehab Act happened, Rehab Act is now part of the workforce development stuff. They've incorporated that into that legislation. But as reauthorizations went through every 5 years, those state councils got more authority. That signature authority over a state plan they got. And they got state councils for independent living, or iCoil in our case, Indiana Council on Independent Living, got more authority, got more specific direction on what they were to do. So that has evolved too through the federal legislation over time.
Great. And obviously you've been a leader in this. Who are some other people that have shown leadership in the area of independent living in the state?
Well, Nancy Griffin, a longtime friend and colleague who's not in Centers for Independent Living, but was at the center here in Indianapolis, formerly URSL. I view Nancy as a leader in the movement. Her husband, John Cardwell, I view him as a leader in the movement. Both people who've been around a long time. Al Tolbert with the center in southern Indiana, in Bedford area. He's a longtime leader and one of the first members of the less powerful iCoil, State Council on Independent Living. He was one of the original members of that council back in the 80s. So right off the top of my head, I would certainly view those three as being people who have been here through a lot of changes and are still here in some capacity. So.
Great, excellent. Could you tell us maybe a little story about what things were like in the early days of the Independent Living Center?
Well, back in the 90s, early 90s, if we go back even to the late 80s, the center then, URSL, now Accessibility, that didn't exist in the 80s up until the late 80s, and they started as a program of United Cerebral Palsy in the late 80s. So even then they weren't a center for independent living. I think it was 88, 89, something like that, when they separated and became a center. So in the very early days, we had two centers in this state. We had then URSL in 1990, a fairly new center, and we had the league then, the Allen County League for the Blind at that time, still a center serving one population for the most part. So we had almost no centers in Indiana. We certainly didn't have a network, and we certainly weren't evolved as a network to the point of embracing the philosophy of the disability rights movement and the philosophy of the independent living movement. We were committed, we knew where we needed to go, and we knew we weren't there. I guess that's how I would characterize the early days in Indiana. We had virtually no political support, which is needed at least in the Centers for Independent Living movement. It was universally understood that if you're a center for independent living, you had to have group homes, which is, of course, absolutely not true. And in fact, if you do, you can't be a center for independent living. So very, very isolated, very much in its infancy. Indiana was a stepchild, almost a stepchild of the national independent living movement. We were so small, we were so new. States around us like Illinois, Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, these were all states in the Midwest, part of our region, Region 5 at the time, that were very evolved compared to us. And If I had to look at it from a perspective of people in Illinois or Wisconsin, I would have probably looked at Indiana almost with a sense of pity. That's where we were. So the early days, you had a lot of good hearts and good intentioned people. You had people coming out of a lot of the great social movements in the 60s and 70s that had come into this movement. Maybe they weren't people with disabilities, but they understood the need for social change. And you had people that wanted to see things change. We were a very patriarchal state and society when it came down to people with disabilities. We were very much into the rehab model and the medical model of people with disabilities. We're here to take care of them. That's what we do. And independent living was coming out with a voice that was saying, yeah, we don't think that's quite right. No, that's not how it works. So that's where we started, and it was literally, and keep in mind that the League got its first Centers for Independent Living money 10 years before that, 9 years before that, and had functioned as this single disability organization basically under the federal rules that it was allowed to. It shouldn't have been allowed to, but it did. So we were in that spot. I can tell you that when I was looking at, when my family was looking at a move to Fort Wayne, I got a call from the regional commissioner out of Chicago in the Federal Department of Education saying that the federal regulations are going to change and not allow you to be a single disability organization. And he told me that I worked for an organization, vocational rehabilitation, that the state funded, that the feds funded, and that the feds' intent was to shut down the League, and I might want to think about that twice before going there. So we were at a stage in the early 90s where the federal tide was turning, and we had to decide: are we gonna adapt and grow, or are we gonna stay the same and probably die? At least in our organization, that's where we were at. So the federal laws were changing. Our neighbors in the states were growing. We were in our infancy. A lot of us had some connections with people in other states that were doing well. We knew how it should be. Nancy had worked in other states. I had spent time at other centers. So we knew where we needed to go. And our big battles in the 90s were really trying to carve out that niche of legitimacy that we didn't have yet, both at the national and regional level, and even within our own state, we didn't have that. And carving that out politically, carving that out with the administration that was in place at the time, that was difficult. You'd win one and lose two. You'd win two and lose one. I mean, it was step forward, step backward. It seemed like for a decade. So it was difficult.
There's so much that we could listen to you about the independent living. I don't want to leave out the other two things that you mentioned as topics. But before we move, say, to vocational rehab, probably that could be your next topic. Jenny had said something about Helen Keller. Is that?
Yeah.
Okay, tell us.
When I went to the League in 1990 as the executive director at that time, I told Jenny, the truth about new executive directors is this: we only know how to do two things: move stuff and clean stuff. That's all we know, for the most part, when we start. And that's what I was doing when I got there. We were moving stuff and cleaning stuff. And in the basement of the facility we were in, we found a box of original documents, original newspaper documents. We found old histories of the organization. And in that box, some of our history that we had forgotten. The League's founders had brought Helen Keller to Fort Wayne in October of 1949 to challenge the community to start that organization, to start then the Allen County League for the Blind. And after that challenge, 1 year later, the League incorporated, and then the year after that got its nonprofit status. But we had no idea that our founders had brought Helen Keller to Fort Wayne to do that. We had lost that part of our history. but we found all the original newspaper bulletins, the original follow-up articles, all that information was in that box. And they weren't copies. Of course, they weren't making copies back then. These were the original documents. So since then, we've preserved those. We had a history with Community Chest, now United Way, that we didn't know about. We found that in that box. I mean, we just found a ton of things that we started in the 90s, working with kids with disabilities and getting them included in summer camps for all people with disabilities, all people, neighborhood kids, kids without disabilities, this getting kids included in these kids programs. We thought we were cutting edge. When we pulled that box of stuff out, they were doing that in the 50s at the League. With kids who are blind. That stuff wasn't new at all. I mean, that stuff was 30 years old. We just forgot that we did it. So we found that all.
We may have to talk to you about some of those artifacts for our project. They
We'd-
might be really very helpful.
We'd love to share those with you. We got a hold of the Historical Society and preserved them according to their instructions. And I had mentioned that we have yet to digitize them, but at least they're on acid-free paper. They're away from the sunlight. They're stored away so that they'll be there.
Excellent.
We'd love to share those with you.
All right, well, maybe we could try to get a brief idea of what you were doing at Voc Rehab and what things were like in the employment sector back then.
I went to vocational rehabilitation as a counselor for the first time in 1978, maybe 79, somewhere in there. And I will tell you, I had been working at a rehabilitation facility, which was a great experience. But vocational rehabilitation was the Cadillac of state employment at that time. I mean, if you worked for the Department of Education or now Workforce Development, it didn't matter where you worked, you wanted to work for vocational rehabilitation. It was the Cadillac. That was the positive side of that. Now, probably the downside of that was we were part of that patriarchal system. The folks we served, this whole concept of people we served being customers or consumers of services, they were clients, we were the professionals, which made us the experts. We had money, we had stuff we could do, and if they wanted it, they better do it our way. That's the way things were. Now, that's probably the downside. You know, back then another upside was that we did have money, and we did a lot of neat stuff. Helping people get associate's degrees and bachelor's degrees, and after checking for financial aid, not necessarily loans, but grants and things like that, after that was exhausted, we could pay all the tuition, all the books and supplies. I remember helping people start their own businesses, small businesses, helping folks get surgeries that they needed to get some functioning back. I don't believe we're wasters of money, but we invested in people with disabilities pretty heavily. That was a positive side. I think we've seen a couple of the positive things go down. I mean, state government across the board seems to be an area where we're losing a lot of talent and a lot of experience. A lot of the veterans, maybe across the board in state government, are leaving, and we're losing a lot of knowledge with that. So vocational rehabilitation today doesn't pull down full funding from the feds. So there's not as much financial support as we had back then. So the desirability of working in that organization, I think it is different than it was several decades ago. Our ability to really have an impact through our dollars, that has probably changed and gone down some. On the upside, though, I think vocational rehabilitation has done a great job of understanding that people with disabilities are to a great degree the expert. Now, VR can't violate policy, and they can't violate federal regulations and laws in their service. They can still say no because they're not in the business of violating the law. But I think they have a much better understanding that the people they serve are consumers of their services. They are experts in the things that affect their life, and they deserve to have control and choice over those things that affect them. I'm not going to speak for everybody in the 70s, but I will tell you I didn't understand that in the 70s. As a counselor, I did not understand that. And it certainly didn't look that way. So to their credit.
You know, this has been great.
Okay.
It's 2:45.
You got to get somebody else in here.
Another person after.
Produced by the Center for Health Equity, Indiana Institute on Disability and Community, Indiana University. Funded in part by a grant from the Indiana Governor's Council for People with Disabilities. Copyright 2018, the Trustees of Indiana University.